Are you two all right? It's going to be okay, the young waitress whispered as she knelt on the polished floor, gently wiping the pasta sauce from the old woman's silver hair. Her name was Emma Frost, 26, her dark hair pulled back, her shoes worn thin at the heel from double shifts. A girl who owned almost nothing and gave away what little she had. Only moments before, the doors of Rosalind's, one of Chicago's finest restaurants, had opened to let in two old people who didn't seem to belong, their coats frayed at the elbows, their shoes held together with tape. The manager sneered that this place didn't serve their kind. A wealthy young woman laughed and poured a full plate of pasta over the old woman's head, while her friend lifted a phone and live-streamed it, giggling as red sauce dripped down silver hair. The whole room laughed. The old man rose from his chair, his hands trembling, his eyes turning cold, and he opened his mouth as if to say something that would change everything. But before he could speak, Emma crossed the room, reached into her apron for a bottle of water she'd been saving, and offered it with a soft, steady voice. "The floor's meant to be walked on," she said, turning to face the manager without a trace of fear. Being poor isn't a crime. What Emma didn't know was who these two ragged strangers really were, or that the man who'd soon walk through that door was the most feared name in the city, and that this single act of kindness was about to shatter her old life completely and rebuild it into something she'd never dared to dream. If you love stories about dignity, second chances, and the kind of love that finds you in your darkest hour, give this video a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Now, let's go back to the moment that small bottle of water changed everything. To understand the weight of that moment with the bottle of water, one must go back several hours, to a time when the evening at Rosalind's had not yet been stained by anything at all. The restaurant stood in Chicago's River North neighborhood, where golden light spilled over tablecloths as white as freshly fallen snow, where crystal glasses were polished until they reflected the faces of the diners, and where the scent of browned butter mingled with the fragrance of aged wine, lingering in the cool air beneath the steady breath of the air conditioning. The place was beautiful in a flawless way, but it was a cold kind of beauty, the kind that made people feel small when their pockets weren't deep enough. And through that cold perfection, Emma Frost moved like a diligent shadow, a tray balanced in her hand, her back straight, her smile always in place, even though her leg had been aching since her first shift began at noon. She was 26 years old, and she had grown accustomed to working 2 shifts in a row, so accustomed that her body had learned how to conserve every last measure of strength. In the mornings, she cleaned a coffee shop 3 blocks away. By late afternoon, she tied on the black apron of Rosalind's, and it wasn't until deep into the night that she returned to the rented studio in the basement of an old building, where the walls were stained with spreading patches of mildew, and the smell of standing water never fully disappeared. The room was so small that she could stand in the middle and reach both the stove and the bed, but it belonged to her. It was the only place in the world where no one raised their voice and demanded something from her. People often believed that those who had known deprivation would learn to keep their hands tightly closed, but life had a way of turning that expectation on its head, because those who had once tasted hunger were often the ones who understood most deeply how a single piece of bread could save a human being. Emma was one of those people. In the pocket of her apron, beside her order pad and pen, she always carried a small bottle of water and several individually wrapped cookies. It wasn't the habit of a waitress. It was the habit of a child who had once gone to sleep with an empty stomach, a child who had learned to hide food in case there was nothing to eat the next day. She had carried those things with her for years, even after hunger was no longer her constant companion, because some scars didn't live on the skin. They lived in habits, quietly reminding people of everything they had survived. In the kitchen, there was only one person who genuinely cared for her: Walter Boyd, the head chef, a man well into his 50s with calloused hands and a voice made rough by decades spent beside blazing ovens. At the end of her shift, Walter would often set aside a bowl of soup while it was still warm and slide it through the kitchen window without saying much. He would simply nod toward it and tell her to eat before she made herself sick. He was a rare trace of warmth in a cold place, and Emma was grateful to him in the way a person was grateful for a small lamp burning in the middle of winter. But if Walter was warmth, Priscilla Vane was ice. Priscilla was the restaurant manager, a woman in her 40s who walked with rigid precision, the heels of her shoes striking the marble floor like the ticking of a countdown clock, her eyes constantly sweeping the room in search of mistakes. To her, customers fell into 2 clearly defined categories: those worthy of a smile and those who weren't even worth noticing. and the line between them was determined by something as simple as the watch on a wrist or the name stitched inside a handbag. Priscilla measured the employees by the same cold standard, and Emma, the poorest of all the servers, with worn heels on her shoes and a fraying coat, always occupied the very bottom of Priscilla's private ranking. Priscilla had never spoken her name with anything resembling kindness. She only snapped her fingers, pointed, and lifted an eyebrow whenever Emma fell even a single beat behind. And still, Emma worked. She lowered her head. She swallowed every cruel word and buried it somewhere inside herself, because she needed this job more than she needed her pride to be soothed, or at least that was what she told herself every night. She didn't know that in only a few hours, this flawless and frigid place would bear witness to something no amount of money could buy, and that she, the young woman who always stood at the bottom of every ranking, was about to become the only person in that crowded room who still possessed what all those wealthy people had lost long ago. At around 7 o'clock that evening, when nearly every table in the dining room was occupied and the soft clatter of silverware blended with the low murmur of conversation, the glass door of Rosalind's opened quietly, and an elderly couple stepped inside. They entered slowly, staying close to one another as though they were afraid of taking up too much space in a place that had never been meant for people like them. The man wore an old, threadbare coat, its elbows worn so thin they were nearly torn through, and his shoes had been wrapped with several strips of gray duct tape to keep the soles from coming apart. The elderly woman beside him had silver-white hair gathered neatly at the nape of her neck, a faded scarf resting loosely across her shoulders, and thin, fragile hands clasped in front of her stomach as though she were trying to hold on to the last of her composure. From a distance, they looked exactly like the image people carried in their minds of a homeless couple who had somehow wandered into a world of luxury by mistake. Yet there was something strange that no one in the restaurant noticed, and it was in their eyes. Neither of them looked confused in the way lost people usually did. Instead, they let their gaze travel slowly and carefully across the room, as though they were searching for something familiar. The old man looked up at the ceiling, where a great crystal chandelier hung above the dining room, and the corner of his mouth moved faintly, as though he knew exactly when that chandelier had first been installed. The elderly woman's eyes lingered for a long moment on the far right corner of the room, where an old piano stood untouched and unplayed, and for the briefest instant, something difficult to name appeared in her expression, something both tender and aching, like a woman returning to visit a home that had once belonged to her. She reached out and gently touched the back of a nearby chair, her fingers gliding over the upholstery, and then she gave the smallest nod, as though confirming something quietly within herself. The man leaned close and whispered a short sentence into her ear, and she answered with a fleeting smile, the kind shared by two people who carried a secret no one else in that crowded room knew existed. The irony rested in the very name displayed above the entrance, on the bronze plaque engraved with the word Rosalind's, a name every elegant diner in River North knew by heart, a name associated with extravagant dinners and glittering prestige, and yet no one had ever stopped to wonder who Rosalind was, what woman had given her name to this place, or whether she had ever stepped through its doors. The silver-haired woman stood in the middle of the dining room and looked toward the faint reflection of that sign in the glass, and there was something deeply unusual in the way she regarded it, as though the name wasn't unfamiliar to her at all. But no one had time to pay attention to those small details, because the familiar sound of heels had begun to strike the floor. Priscilla Vane approached from the hostess stand, her posture rigid and precise, her eyes immediately sweeping over the two new guests from head to toe, and within an instant, she had placed them into the exact category she reserved for people she didn't consider worth noticing. The professional smile on Priscilla's lips vanished, replaced by a look of suspicion mixed with contempt that showed clearly across her perfectly made-up face. She stepped directly into their path, folded her arms across her chest, and in the falsely sweet voice she always used to wrap around her cruelties, she asked whether they had a reservation, even though she and the elderly couple both knew the question was only the opening move before she ordered them back outside. The old man calmly replied that they simply wished to have dinner, and his voice was so composed that Priscilla hesitated for a moment, because it wasn't the voice of someone who had come to beg for food. It was the voice of a man who was accustomed to being heard. But the hesitation lasted only a second before Priscilla curled her lips again, glanced toward the well-dressed patrons who had begun turning to watch, and lowered her voice as she explained that this was an upscale restaurant, that perhaps they had mistaken the address, and that this place probably wasn't suitable for them. Several diners at a nearby table had already stopped eating and turned fully in their seats to observe, and among them, Two glamorous young women sitting beside the window began exchanging delighted looks, as though a piece of free entertainment had just been served directly in front of them. The atmosphere in the dining room began to change. The chill from the air conditioning seemed to sink more deeply into the room, and from a shadowed corner near the kitchen entrance, Emma Frost stood holding her tray and looked toward the door, seized by the quiet certainty that something ugly was about to happen. After wiping the last traces of sauce from the elderly woman's silver hair and placing the bottle of water into her trembling hands, Emma didn't stop there. She straightened, pulled 2 chairs away from an empty table near the kitchen entrance, the very table she was supposed to serve that evening, and in a voice that was gentle yet firm, invited the elderly couple to sit down, telling them they didn't need to remain standing for another second. The old man looked at her with a flicker of hesitation in his eyes, as though he wasn't accustomed to being treated kindly in a place that had just tried to drive him away. But Emma simply smiled, gently took the elderly woman by the elbow, and helped her into the chair with the same care she might have shown her own grandmother. She spread a clean napkin across the woman's lap, poured water from the porcelain pitcher on the table into a glass, then took the order pad from her apron pocket and asked what they would like to eat, treating them with precisely the same courtesy she offered the wealthiest guests in the room. The old man hesitantly explained that they were afraid they couldn't afford to order anything there, speaking so softly that only Emma could hear him, but she merely shook her head and told them that tonight they were her guests, that she would take care of the bill, and that all they needed to do was choose whatever they wanted. She said it calmly, without any trace of self-importance, as though spending nearly an entire shift's wages to buy dinner for 2 strangers were the most natural thing in the world. In the kitchen, Walter Boyd watched her bring in the order ticket, and when she quietly told him that the meal should be deducted from her pay, he studied her for a moment before giving a silent nod. Then his calloused hands began preparing the food with the same care he reserved for the restaurant's most important patrons, because he understood the heart of that young woman better than anyone. But not everyone watched the scene with warmth in their eyes. From the table beside the window, the 2 elegantly dressed young women, Bianca Thorne and Chelsea Rayland, followed Emma's every movement with open irritation, whispering cruel remarks to one another, saying that the waitress was making a fool of herself, that kindness like hers was nothing more than a cheap performance meant to attract attention. Bianca curled her lip and remarked that perhaps Emma ought to remember she was only 1 step above the 2 beggars herself, while Chelsea let out a scornful laugh, her eyes filled with contempt. Emma didn't look back. She didn't allow their words to touch her, because all her attention was fixed on the elderly couple, whose shoulders were slowly beginning to relax as they sat at the table. Then the sound of heels rang out again, sharp and hurried. Priscilla Vane strode toward her, her face dark with fury, pulled Emma into a shadowed corner near one of the columns, and hissed through quick, furious breaths, demanding to know what she thought she was doing and whether she understood that she was disgracing the restaurant in front of so many important patrons. She warned Emma that if she continued with this ridiculous display, her position at the restaurant would be re-evaluated the very next morning, and that Priscilla would personally make certain she paid a heavy price for her insolence. It was a threat powerful enough to make any employee retreat, because Emma needed this job to pay the rent on her damp basement room, to keep food in her stomach, and to send money to the people she still called family. She understood the cost of defying Priscilla better than anyone, but she simply looked the manager directly in the eyes and, in a voice that was strangely calm, said that she was prepared to take responsibility for every dish she had ordered, that she would pay for it with her own money, and that she didn't believe allowing 2 exhausted human beings to sit down and eat a decent meal could possibly tarnish anything. The answer left Priscilla speechless for a moment, her face flushing crimson with outrage that an insignificant employee had dared answer her back. But with so many eyes watching, she could do nothing except clench her teeth and walk away, leaving her threat hanging heavily in the air. Emma returned to the table, unaware that the elderly couple's expressions had changed. The old man no longer looked at her with the wary uncertainty of someone receiving charity. Instead, he watched her with a deep, intent gaze, as though he were quietly engraving every gesture she made into his memory. The elderly woman followed Emma's small figure with her eyes as the young waitress hurried between tables, and the aching light that had filled her gaze earlier had now given way to something far warmer, something almost like emotion, almost like a hope she had long believed she would never find in another human being again. The 2 of them looked at each other, and this time, the whispered words they exchanged no longer sounded like the secret of 2 mysterious strangers. They carried the quiet weight of a decision that had just been made. Near midnight, When the final shift had ended and the golden lights of Rosalind's had gone dark behind her, Emma dragged her aching feet back to the basement studio, her clothes still carrying the smell of food and sweat from a day that had seemed endless. All she wanted was to lower herself onto the narrow bed, close her eyes, and let her exhausted body rest. But the moment she opened the door and stepped inside, she stopped. The light in the room was already on, and sitting on her bed were her mother, Wanda Frost, and her older sister, Coralie, both wearing expressions tight with tension and irritation, as though they were the ones who had been forced to wait too long. Emma hadn't even had time to remove her coat before Wanda sprang to her feet and sharply demanded to know why she had come home so late when the entire family had been worried sick. Coralie remained seated with her arms folded, her eyes moving over the cramped room with their familiar contempt, then announced that their younger brother, Beckett, was in the hospital, that his condition was very serious, and that they needed money immediately. Emma felt her heart tighten at the sound of Beckett's name, and she hurriedly asked what had happened to him and whether he was badly hurt. But both her mother and sister avoided her eyes, repeating only that none of that mattered as much as the fact that she needed to hand over the money right now. Wanda began reciting all the sacrifices she had made to raise Emma, insisting that a devoted daughter would never allow her younger brother to suffer, and her voice rose higher and grew sharper with every sentence, as though the slightest hesitation from Emma would make her a sinner beyond forgiveness. Coralie joined in, calling her selfish, accusing her of living comfortably on her own, while the rest of the family struggled, saying that she cared about no one but herself. And those words pierced Emma in the way only family knew how to wound someone so deeply. Emma stood there, her legs still trembling from exhaustion, listening to the familiar accusations she had heard for so many years, and she felt a weariness heavier than the combined burden of both her shifts, the weariness of someone who was always forced to prove her love with money. She didn't argue. She had never truly been able to argue with them. Instead, she quietly crossed the room, pulled open the old drawer where she kept her meager savings, the bills she had carefully calculated and set aside for the next month's rent, and counted out nearly all of it, leaving herself with an amount so small it wouldn't be enough to survive the week. She pressed the money into her mother's hand, and Wanda took it so quickly that she didn't even pause to say thank you. She merely glanced at the bills and slipped them into her purse, while Coralie rose, brushed off her skirt, and remarked that Emma ought to have more prepared next time. Then the two women left together, abandoning the room to silence, and leaving Emma collapsed on the edge of the bed with her face buried in her hands. She didn't cry, because tears were another luxury she had learned to conserve long ago, but inside her was a cold and hollow emptiness, the feeling of someone who kept giving and never received anything in return, not even a simple question asking whether she had been all right that day. She sat that way for a long time, until the old phone on the table suddenly vibrated, its screen lighting up with an unfamiliar number she had never seen before. She hesitated before answering, and from the other end came the low, rough voice of a man speaking slowly, carrying the heavy accent of someone from another country, perhaps somewhere in Eastern Europe. The man didn't give his name. He only asked whether she was Beckett Frost's sister, and when Emma confusedly confirmed that she was, his voice grew colder. He said slowly that her brother owed a considerable amount of money, that it was time for her family to think about paying it, and that it would be better for everyone if she cooperated. A chill swept down Emma's spine. She quickly demanded to know who he was, whom Beckett owed, and what kind of debt he was talking about. But the man on the other end merely gave a quiet, suggestive laugh before ending the call, leaving the steady sound of the disconnected line echoing through the dark room. Emma sat frozen, gripping the phone tightly in her hand, and for the first time that night, a vague but unmistakably real fear began to creep into her heart. She had the growing sense that the hospital was only the story on the surface, that her brother had become entangled in something far darker than anything her mother and sister were willing to reveal, and that the cold voice she had just heard was only the beginning of a storm she didn't yet know was quietly moving toward her. What no one at the restaurant had anticipated was that the video Chelsea Rayland recorded that evening wouldn't remain hidden inside her phone. Before the night was over, while Emma was still sitting in stunned silence in her darkened room after the strange phone call, the clip had already been uploaded to social media, at first as nothing more than a thoughtless act of showing off among wealthy friends, the kind of content Chelsea believed would make her appear sophisticated and powerful in the eyes of her followers. But she had miscalculated disastrously. The video captured the silver-haired elderly woman being humiliated in the middle of an elegant restaurant, the entire room laughing at the shame of two suffering human beings. and then the sight of a small waitress quietly kneeling to wipe away the stains with such tenderness that it left viewers unable to speak. Every one of those images touched something deep inside the people who watched. Within only a few hours, the number of views leaped from a few hundred to tens of thousands, then to hundreds of thousands, and by the following morning, when Emma awoke with dark circles beneath her eyes after a night in which she had barely slept, the clip had spread across the city like a fire no one could extinguish. Comments poured in like a flood, and nearly all of them carried the same unmistakable emotion: outrage. People condemned the cruelty of the wealthy guests who had treated human dignity with contempt. They demanded that the identity of the young woman who had dumped a plate of pasta over the elderly woman's head be exposed. They shared the moment of the poor waitress bending down again and again, adding captions that said this was what a real human being looked like. The name Rosalind's, once associated with dazzling prestige and extravagant dinners, was now being repeated everywhere, alongside furious criticism, and the restaurant's review page began filling with one-star ratings from people who had never even stepped through its doors. When Priscilla Vane entered the restaurant that morning, she immediately realized that something terrible had happened. Her phone vibrated without pause, filled with missed calls from numbers she didn't recognize, and when a trembling employee showed her the clip, along with the view count climbing by the minute, the color visibly drained from Priscilla's perfectly made-up face. Fear appeared plainly in her eyes. Not fear because she had allowed something inhuman to happen directly in front of her, but fear for her position as manager, for the restaurant's reputation, and for the generous income she had worked so carefully to protect. And like those who knew only how to save themselves, Priscilla's first instinct wasn't remorse. It was to find someone else to blame. She summoned Emma to her private office the moment the young woman arrived, and before Emma could even understand what was happening, Priscilla unleashed a stream of accusations, claiming that Emma had staged the entire spectacle, that her false display of kindness the night before had been nothing more than a scheme to attract attention and turn the restaurant into a public disgrace. She insisted that if Emma hadn't interfered, if she hadn't created that sentimental scene of kneeling and cleaning, there would have been no viral video, no storm of public fury, and now everything was her fault. Emma stood stunned by the shamelessness of the accusation. She tried to explain that she had only done what anyone with a conscience should have done, that she hadn't known anyone was filming, but Priscilla didn't want to hear a word of it. In the manager's mind, a decision had already begun to take shape. The fastest way to calm the anger of the owners and the public was to find a scapegoat, and that scapegoat would be the poorest, loneliest employee in the building, the one with no powerful person standing behind her. Emma. Priscilla coldly told her to prepare herself, that her position at the restaurant was more uncertain than ever, and that the evening ahead might very well be her final shift. While Emma stood there bearing the full weight of that injustice, the two women who had truly caused everything were living in an entirely different world elsewhere in the city. Bianca Thorne and Chelsea Rayland sat in an elegant cafe, scrolling through the video that had ignited the city with a calmness so complete it was chilling. Chelsea even laughed, saying that people online were bored and hypocritical, that in a few days everyone would forget the whole thing and find some new outrage to occupy them. Bianca nodded in agreement, confident that with her family's wealth and connections, no crowd of anonymous commenters could ever touch her, that money and power always found a way to make small inconveniences like this disappear. The two young women raised their coffee cups and laughed as though they had merely witnessed a passing amusement, never once realizing that the video wasn't simply a brief wave of public anger. It had already reached the eyes of people they would never have dared imagine, people whose single nod could overturn their entire lives. The tension continued to gather, like a rope being pulled tighter and tighter toward its breaking point, and not one of them, not Priscilla as she plotted Emma's dismissal, not the two privileged young women laughing without a care, knew that within only a few hours, black cars would begin moving toward Rosalind's, carrying with them a truth that was about to leave every one of them speechless. That evening passed beneath an unusually suffocating tension, because news of the video had thrown the entire restaurant into turmoil. Employees whispered behind one another's backs, while Priscilla Vane moved between the tables with her face drawn as tight as a wire, struggling to appear composed before a dining room that was far emptier than usual. By the time darkness had settled over the city and the last guests had departed, Priscilla summoned Emma into the center of the dining room, directly in front of every remaining employee, because she wanted to turn what was about to happen into a warning for them all. In a cold and condescending voice, she announced that from that moment forward, Emma was no longer an employee of Rosalind's, that everything she had caused had seriously damaged the restaurant's reputation, and that Priscilla had no choice but to terminate her employment immediately in order to salvage the situation. She deliberately added that someone like Emma should have been grateful to have been given the job at all, instead of destroying it with what Priscilla called a cheap and pathetic display of false heroism. The entire room fell silent. Several employees lowered their heads, unable to look at Emma. Some wanted to speak in her defense, but fear of the manager's authority kept them quiet. Only Walter Boyd, the elderly head chef, stepped out from the kitchen with flour still clinging to his hands, his eyes burning with anger as he looked at Priscilla, but Emma gently shook her head at him, silently asking him not to bring trouble upon himself for her sake. Emma stood there beneath the weight of every watching eye, her back still straight, and though a storm of humiliation and exhaustion was raging inside her, she didn't shed a single tear. She merely untied the familiar black apron that had accompanied her through so many long and punishing shifts, folded it neatly, and placed it on the nearest table. She was about to say something, perhaps only a quiet farewell, when at that very moment, the glow beyond the restaurant's broad glass windows suddenly began to change. A line of sleek black cars, long and luxurious enough to steal the breath from anyone who saw them, slowly pulled up along the curb outside Rosalind's, one behind another like the procession of some unseen power that didn't belong to the ordinary world. The vehicles came to a stop almost simultaneously, their engines falling silent with an eerie finality, and inside the restaurant, every sound ceased as every gaze turned toward the entrance. The door of the lead car opened first, and a tall man stepped out wearing a perfectly fitted black suit. His movements were calm yet commanding, and his face was cold and completely unreadable. It was Gideon Marsh, though no one inside the restaurant knew his name yet. They only sensed at once that he wasn't an ordinary guest. Gideon approached the glass entrance, opened it, and remained standing rigidly beside it, his eyes sweeping across the room as though he were taking control of the entire space. The way he stood there, silent yet unmistakably threatening, sent a chill down Priscilla's spine before she even understood why. Then a second figure emerged slowly from the same car, and the instant his shoes touched the sidewalk, the air around Rosalind seemed to grow heavy and dense. The man appeared to be in his 30s, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a long charcoal coat. His face was sharply defined, and his eyes were deep and keen as blades, the eyes of someone accustomed to viewing the world from the summit of power and expecting everything within it to bend to his will. He entered the restaurant, each footstep sounding clearly against the marble floor in the absolute silence, and without his having to utter a single word. Everyone present instinctively understood that the man who had just crossed that threshold commanded a kind of power ordinary wealth could never equal. He was Oliver Falcone, a name people in Chicago usually dared only to whisper, never to speak aloud, a name that made even the most influential men proceed with caution. Priscilla still didn't recognize him, but she felt her legs begin to tremble, and out of professional instinct, she hurried toward him with a strained smile, preparing to ask how she might assist such an honored guest. Oliver didn't even spare her a glance. His cold eyes passed over Priscilla, as though she were transparent, then settled on the elderly couple still seated at the table near the kitchen entrance, the two ragged people whom everyone in that room had humiliated only the night before. And what left them all frozen, what made Priscilla's heart seem to stop beating, was the sight of that terrifyingly powerful man walking directly toward the elderly couple. For one fleeting moment, his ice-cold expression softened, and everyone in the restaurant heard his deep voice speak two words no one could possibly have expected, causing the air itself to freeze in that fateful instant. The two words Oliver Falcone spoke into the breathless silence of the restaurant were so simple that no one could have imagined them. Father and mother. The most powerful man that room had ever witnessed walked toward the two elderly people in their ragged clothes, and before the astonished eyes of everyone present, he slowly lowered himself onto one knee against the marble floor until he was level with them. The hands that were accustomed to giving orders now gently closed around the thin, fragile hand of the silver-haired woman. He bowed his head, and his deep voice grew rough with an emotion no one had ever imagined a man like him could carry inside. As he quietly asked whether his mother was all right, whether she had been hurt, and why she and his father had taken such a dangerous risk without saying a single word to him, the elderly woman, whom the entire room had humiliated and trampled upon only the night before, lifted a trembling hand and stroked the sharp planes of that terrifying man's face, as though comforting a child. She smiled and told him that she was fine, that she had seen what she needed to see. It was as though the entire restaurant had been struck by a wave of freezing water. Scattered gasps of disbelief rose from around the room, and Priscilla Vane, the manager who only moments earlier had loudly fired Emma and treated the elderly couple with contempt, now stood rooted to the floor, her face drained white, her lips moving without producing a single sound. Oliver rose and turned to face the room, and his gaze had returned to the coldness of ice as it swept across every stunned face before him. He began to speak in a voice that was quiet and controlled, yet every word carried the weight of stone, and what he revealed caused every scattered piece in the minds of those listening to lock together with chilling clarity. He explained that many years earlier, when he had only just begun building his fortune, the first thing he did was create a restaurant for his parents, Arthur Falcone and his mother, a place of beauty and elegance meant to repay them for all the years of poverty they had endured when he was a child, those days when she had gone without food so that her son could eat. He had named the restaurant after her, Rosalind, the name engraved in bronze and displayed proudly above the entrance, though for all those years, no one had ever cared enough to ask whom it belonged to. In that instant, the entire room understood, and a shiver ran down the spines of everyone present, because the silver-haired woman who had been covered in pasta and driven away like a beggar was Rosalind herself. She was the woman for whom this magnificent restaurant had been named, the living soul of the very place that had rejected her. Oliver continued, his voice growing colder with every sentence, saying that his parents had risen from nothing, that to them, Rosalind's wasn't merely an investment or a place created to display wealth. It was their heart, their dream, a place where they had hoped every person who entered would be treated with equal kindness, whether rich or poor, respected or overlooked. He explained that in recent months, after he had entrusted the restaurant to others and stopped visiting as often, his parents had begun hearing troubling rumors about the way guests were being treated. Instead of ordering a conventional investigation, they had chosen to do something only people with truly uncorrupted hearts might have imagined. They disguised themselves as two impoverished strangers, dressed in the most ragged clothes they could find, and came to witness with their own eyes whether the place bearing their name still possessed the compassion they had once placed within it. They hadn't come to catch anyone making a mistake. They had come searching for the answer to a question that had haunted them through countless nights, whether human beings, once they possessed money and power, could still look upon another person and see a human being. And the answer they received, Oliver said, his voice sinking beneath pain and fury, was cruelty, laughter, and a plate of food emptied over his mother's silver hair, while others watched with delight. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle into every person in the room, then added that if cruelty had been all his parents found, he might have arrived that night in an entirely different state of mind, one that no one in that restaurant would have wanted to face. But, and he placed unmistakable emphasis on that word, in the middle of all that cruelty, his parents had found something that allowed them to believe in humanity again. A small light, yet warm enough to drive away the darkness of an entire night of horror. As he spoke those words, Oliver Falcone's sharp, frozen gaze slowly moved away from Priscilla, away from the trembling employees, and came to rest upon the small figure standing silently beside a table, her folded apron lying on its surface, the young woman who had been dismissed only minutes before. And in the absolute silence of the room, every pair of eyes followed his gaze and turned toward Emma Frost. Under Oliver Falcone's gaze, with the attention of the entire room fixed upon her, Emma could only stand in silence, her hands lightly clasped together, because she had never expected anything in return. She hadn't hoped for praise, and she certainly hadn't hoped to be rewarded. She had simply done what her conscience told her was right. But Oliver didn't leave her standing in discomfort for long. He gave her a small nod, a quiet gesture that carried the full weight of his respect, then turned toward Gideon Marsh and signaled to him. Gideon silently took out a tablet, worked on it for a few seconds, and at once, the large screen normally used to display the restaurant's special menu came to life, replaying the very clip that had swept across the city, the video that had captured every detail of the previous night's cruelty, without leaving out a single moment. Everyone in the room was forced to witness the scene again, and this time, there was no laughter, only the suffocating silence of people whose true faces had just been exposed. Oliver allowed the video to play until the end, then turned toward Priscilla Vane, who was now trembling so violently that she had to grip the back of a chair to keep from collapsing. In a voice so calm it was frightening, he told her that he didn't need to destroy a woman like her, because her own actions had already dug the grave in which she would fall. He revealed that after his parents had begun to suspect something was wrong, his people had quietly reviewed every financial record connected to Rosalind's, and what they had uncovered was even more infuriating than her contempt for others. There had been a series of carefully concealed withdrawals, fraudulent invoices, and non-existent suppliers Priscilla had created in order to steal money from the restaurant for months. The color in Priscilla's face shifted from deathly white to a sickly gray. She stammered out denials, but Oliver merely gave another signal, and Gideon placed a thick file on the table, filled with evidence that had already been gathered and would soon be turned over to the authorities. Oliver told her that from that moment forward, she hadn't only lost her job, she would also face the law for embezzlement, and he would allow justice to do exactly what it was meant to do, legally and without mercy. Priscilla collapsed into the chair, every trace of her usual arrogance and superiority gone. Now she was nothing more than a woman driven into a corner by her own greed and cruelty. But Oliver wasn't finished. He turned to Gideon and asked about the two young women who had caused everything, and Gideon calmly reported that their identities had been confirmed. They were Bianca Thorne and Chelsea Rayland, daughters of two prominent business families in the city. What those privileged young women could never have imagined was that the profitable ventures their families depended upon were deeply tied to contracts and relationships quietly influenced by the Falcone family's network. With only a few discreet phone calls during the night, Oliver caused the doors that had always stood open to the Thorne and Rayland families to begin closing one after another. Business partners suddenly withdrew. Contracts still under negotiation were canceled without explanation. The elite events Bianca and Chelsea had always been proud to attend began quietly removing their names from the guest lists. At the same time, as the video continued to spread and people online uncovered the identity of the young woman who had dumped a plate of pasta over the elderly woman's head, a fierce wave of public rejection descended upon Bianca and Chelsea. Those who had once surrounded them with flattery quietly disappeared. Friends turned away. The glittering world the two young women had always believed money would protect forever suddenly crumbled like a castle made of sand. Their punishment didn't come through violence, through a fist, or through a threat. It came through the natural consequences of what they themselves had planted, a cold, lawful judgment they couldn't deny. Through all of it, Emma stood quietly watching, and there wasn't even the smallest trace of satisfaction or triumph in her heart. She watched Priscilla collapse. She thought of the ruin waiting for the two young women, and all she felt was a gentle sadness, a quiet regret for people who had allowed pride and indifference to guide them to the edge of destruction. Rosalind, still seated in the chair where Emma had once cared for her so tenderly, watched the young woman's face and smiled, because that response, Emma's refusal to take pleasure in another person's pain, was the clearest proof of all that the kindness she had shown them the night before had been real, pure gold untouched by anything false. As the turmoil of that evening gradually settled, and the remaining employees were finally allowed to leave in a state of stunned disbelief, Oliver Falcone didn't hurry away. He pulled a chair closer to the table where his parents were seated and gestured for Emma to join them, an invitation that left her flustered because she still couldn't believe how completely the world around her had turned upside down in the span of a single evening. She approached hesitantly, her hands still trembling faintly, and perched on the edge of the chair as though she might rise and leave at any moment. Rosalind looked at her with gentle eyes, then reached out and took Emma's calloused hand, the hand that had carried trays through so many long shifts, and softly told her that throughout the previous evening, among all the cold faces and mocking laughter, Emma had been the only person who had looked at them as real human beings, rather than as two wretched people unworthy of respect. Arthur, seated beside his wife, nodded as well, his warm, deep voice saying that over the course of his life, he had met countless people who were kind when he was wealthy and powerful, but true kindness revealed itself only when someone didn't know who stood before them, and Emma had shown them that rare kind of goodness. Then Oliver spoke, going directly to what he wanted to say. He explained that Rosalind's now needed a new manager, someone who not only knew how to run the restaurant, but more importantly, someone who understood how to protect the heart his parents had placed within it, and he wanted that person to be Emma. The offer was delivered calmly, but with unmistakable certainty, and for a moment, the entire room seemed to fall still. Emma looked up at him, her eyes widening in disbelief, then slowly but firmly shook her head. She said she couldn't accept the position, that she was only an ordinary waitress, that she had never studied management, had never been responsible for anything larger than a tray of food, and that there were countless people more capable than she was who deserved such an opportunity. She said she was afraid she would ruin the place Arthur and Rosalind had poured their hearts into. That kindness and the ability to carry the responsibility of a renowned restaurant were two entirely different things. Her refusal wasn't false modesty. It came from a humility so genuine that Oliver could only fall silent and study her, because he had grown far too accustomed to people waiting for the chance to seize every opportunity and climb higher, people willing to do almost anything to possess what Emma was sincerely turning away. Yet that very hesitation, that fear that she wasn't worthy enough, only confirmed more strongly that she was exactly the person the restaurant needed. Rosalind tightened her hold on Emma's hand and, in the gentle voice of a mother, told her that she didn't need someone who already knew everything about management, because those skills could be learned with time, taught, and strengthened through practice. What she needed, what money couldn't buy, and no school could teach, was a heart that knew how to treat people with dignity. And Emma already possessed that heart. She had proven it through her own actions on a night when everyone else had chosen to turn away. Rosalind told her that she believed in her, that she and Arthur would remain beside her and support her, and that Emma wouldn't have to carry the burden alone. Arthur then spoke, calmly encouraging her to accept, to see it as a chance to prove to herself that she deserved good things, because he believed she had spent her entire life giving to others without ever allowing herself to receive anything in return. Emma lowered her head, and inside her, a struggle unfolded between fear of a responsibility that seemed far too great and the overwhelming emotion she felt at the trust these strangers had placed in her, a trust that even her own family had never once offered. She thought of the damp basement room, of the last of her savings that had just been taken from her, of the cold voice on the telephone the night before, and she understood that perhaps this was her only chance to change her life, not for wealth or luxury, but so she could finally stand firmly on her own 2 feet. After a long silence, she raised her head, her eyes still glistening, and in a quiet but sincere voice, she said that she would try, that she would accept, but that she wanted to learn one step at a time, and hoped they wouldn't place their expectations too high. Rosalind smiled, and for the first time that evening, the corner of Oliver's mouth lifted ever so slightly, while in the sharp eyes that had grown accustomed to viewing the world with suspicion, something unfamiliar appeared for a fleeting moment. Something even he hadn't yet found a name for. The first few weeks in her new position were anything but easy for Emma, because managing a renowned restaurant like Rosalind's demanded countless things she had never known before, from arranging employee schedules and overseeing the supply of ingredients to handling the most demanding guests. Yet she learned quickly, not through cunning or ambition, but through devotion and the sincere way she cared about every person working under her. She remembered the names of the dishwasher's wife and children, asked after a server whenever they appeared tired, and treated Walter Boyd, the elderly head chef, with the respect of a student toward a trusted teacher, often going down to the kitchen to listen to his guidance. In only a short time, the atmosphere inside the restaurant began to change. The employees who had once grown accustomed to lowering their heads in fear under Priscilla now worked with a greater sense of ease, and strangely enough, that very change caused the quality of service to improve noticeably. What Emma never realized was that during those evenings, Oliver Falcone often stopped by in silence. He never announced himself and never made a display of his presence. He simply chose a secluded table in the corner, ordered a glass of wine, and sat there quietly watching her work. He was a man shaped by shadows and calculation, someone who had long since learned to see through the true motives behind every human action. And at first, he told himself he was merely checking whether placing the restaurant in her hands had been a mistake. But the longer he watched, the more he found himself drawn toward something he couldn't explain. He had spent his entire life surrounded by people who always wanted something from him, people who flattered him, people who feared him, people who pretended to be loyal so they could profit from his power, until he had come to believe that every relationship was built upon exchange. Yet in that small, quiet woman, he found no trace of such calculation. Emma wasn't afraid of him in the way everyone else was. She didn't flatter him or search for ways to win his favor. She treated him exactly as she treated anyone else who entered the restaurant, with sincere courtesy, but never with servility. One evening, when several employees began speaking again about what had happened to Priscilla and the 2 young women, Oliver happened to overhear Emma quietly say that she felt relieved justice had been done, but that part of her still ached for them. When he called her over and asked directly whether she believed he had gone too far, Emma didn't avoid the question. She looked straight into his sharp, cold eyes and, in a voice both calm and honest, said that people who did wrong deserved to face the consequences of their actions, and she didn't disagree with that. But she believed that even when punishing someone, a person should still leave them a path back, a way to begin again, because driving someone into a corner of absolute despair had never made the world a better place. She didn't say those words to lecture him, nor did she say them to please him. She spoke them simply because they were what she truly believed. Oliver remained silent for a long time after hearing her, because throughout all the years he had held power in his hands, no one had ever dared speak to him that way. No one had ever possessed enough courage to look directly at him and calmly express a belief that opposed his own. Everyone else only nodded and praised every decision he made, whether it was right or wrong, while this woman dared to speak to him of mercy, of leaving another person a way to survive, inside the very place where he had just used his influence to crush those who had humiliated his mother. He realized then that what drew him toward her wasn't her beauty or her gentleness, but something far rarer, an integrity that couldn't be shaken, a heart that neither power nor fear could bend. For a man who had grown too familiar with deception, meeting someone so completely genuine was like a traveler lost in the desert suddenly discovering a stream of cool, clear water. From that evening onward, Oliver's visits became more frequent, and though neither of them ever spoke of it, something fragile yet undeniably real began to form between them. A quiet understanding, a curiosity touched by caution, an emotion stretched taut like a thread between two people, from worlds that couldn't have been more different. One who lived in the light of kindness and one who had grown accustomed to the darkness of power, yet both of them were being drawn toward each other by the very qualities one possessed and the other lacked. As time passed, the boundary between Oliver and Emma gradually began to blur, and his visits to the restaurant no longer ended, with him merely sitting in silence and watching her from a distance. He began asking her to stay after closing, when the final guests had gone home and only the soft glow of the lights and the hush of the empty dining room remained, so they could share a late dinner prepared by Walter Boyd himself. During those quiet evenings, Emma slowly came to see a different Oliver Falcone, a man who wasn't merely the feared name the entire city spoke only in whispers. He told her about his childhood, about the years of poverty when his family had possessed nothing, about the image of his mother going hungry so there would be enough food for him, and about his father working himself to the edge of exhaustion, yet still failing to earn enough to keep them secure. He told her how he had been forced to become hard at a very young age, how he had learned to survive in a world that allowed no room for weakness, and as he spoke of those things, his voice carried a loneliness so deep that he had never allowed anyone else to see it. Emma listened, and she began to understand that behind that frightening, impenetrable exterior lived a man who had once been wounded, a poor little boy who had been forced to make himself strong so he could protect the people he loved. There were moments when he spoke of his mother and the sharpness in his eyes softened so completely that Emma felt her heart tighten, and she caught herself being drawn toward him far more deeply than she had ever intended to allow. But Oliver's world wasn't made only of that hidden gentleness. During those same late evenings, Emma sometimes witnessed another side of him, the side she had previously known only through rumors. Once, in the middle of dinner, his phone rang, and when he answered it and stepped toward a secluded corner, the warmth that had filled his voice only moments earlier vanished entirely. In its place came a tone as cold as ice, each word sharp and final as the edge of a blade, delivering orders she couldn't fully understand but whose terrible weight she could still feel. In that moment, the man who had just spoken to her with quiet tenderness about his mother became a complete stranger, someone who held the power to decide matters she didn't dare imagine. When he returned to the table, his face had settled once more into its composed expression, as though nothing had happened, and it was the effortless coldness of that transformation that made Emma shiver. She began paying closer attention, and little by little, through fragments of conversations, through the people who came and went to meet Oliver with expressions that blended reverence and fear, through the way Gideon avoided her eyes whenever she asked a question that reached too deeply, she gradually realized that the elegant chain of restaurants bearing the Falcone family name, including Rosalind's, wasn't simply a collection of legitimate businesses. Behind that polished exterior stretched an intricate network of relationships and interests belonging to an underworld she had never dared enter, a world of power, of reckonings carried out in darkness, of unwritten laws whose violation demanded a terrible price. The discovery frightened Emma in a way nothing else had. That night, she sat alone in her small room, with her heart pounding as each scattered piece slowly fell into place inside her mind. She thought of the man who had treated her with respect, who had trusted her with an entire restaurant, who had stirred her heart in a way no one ever had before. And then she thought of the dark world surrounding him, a world of blood and shadow that could swallow someone like her whole with the slightest touch. She had only just escaped a family that had spent years draining and tormenting her. She had fought her entire life for the smallest measure of peace, and now she understood that the new path fate had opened before her led directly into a danger more terrifying than anything she had ever known. One part of her wanted to turn away and run, to give everything back and return to her old life, poor but safe. Yet another part of her, the part that had already seen the loneliness in Oliver's eyes, the part that had already been moved by the wounds he kept hidden, couldn't bring itself to walk away. And that struggle, between fear and fascination, between the reason that warned her to stay far from him and the heart that whispered for her to remain, became a new kind of prison around her soul, forcing her to admit that she had fallen far more deeply into Oliver Falcone's world than she had ever dared confess. While Emma was still struggling with the frightening truth she had discovered about Oliver's world, elsewhere in the city, inside a dimly lit room hidden deep within a nightclub whose true owner was known to very few, a man was studying the photographs spread across the table before him. His name was Von Sokolov, a name spoken in Chicago's underworld with nearly as much caution as the Falcone family name, because he was Oliver's longtime rival, the man who had repeatedly tried to erode the Falcone family's territory and influence, only to be stopped every time. Von was roughly Oliver's age, but his appearance couldn't have been more different. His hair was slicked neatly back, and a smile always rested on his lips, though it never reached his cold and calculating eyes. He was a patient man, someone who never attacked directly, but instead searched for cracks, weaknesses, and unguarded openings through which he could quietly enter. For years, what had frustrated him most was that Oliver Falcone seemed to have no weakness at all. Oliver lived alone, with no wife, no children, and no concern beyond his work and his family, cold and untouchable, like a fortress without a door. But now, spread across the table before Vaughn were secretly taken photographs of a small young woman, images showing Oliver seated in a secluded corner of a restaurant with his eyes following her as she worked, images of the two of them sharing late dinners after closing. Vaughn lifted one of the photographs and studied Emma's face, and the corner of his mouth curved into a sinister smile, because after so many years of searching, he had finally discovered what he believed was the first crack in his enemy's fortress. The cold and invulnerable man did, after all, have a vulnerable place, and that vulnerable place was named Emma Frost. But what made the entire situation even more chilling, something not even Emma could have imagined, was that the name Frost wasn't unfamiliar to Vaughn. He gave a slight signal, and one of his men stepped forward and placed another file on the table, filled with detailed records of a debt bearing the name Beckett Frost. It turned out that many months earlier, long before Vaughn knew Emma existed or understood her connection to Oliver, the underground gambling houses under his control had already become the place where Beckett, Emma's reckless younger brother, had fallen into ruin. At first, Beckett had been nothing more than another desperate gambler, an anonymous name recorded in a debt ledger. But when Vaughn's men followed the trail and discovered that the debtor's sister was the very woman Oliver Falcone had begun watching so closely, everything changed. In Vaughn's eyes, that seemingly ordinary debt suddenly became a valuable weapon, a rope he could use to pull unseen strings from a distance. He realized that instead of wasting time approaching Emma clumsily, he already possessed the perfect leverage, her own flesh and blood. By tightening his hold on Beckett's debt and placing pressure on both the young man and Emma's family, he could lure her into a trap without her ever realizing it. And through her, he would reach Oliver and find a way to bring down the enemy he had hated for so long. The cold phone call with the heavy foreign accent that Emma had received that night, the call that had planted the first vague seed of fear inside her, hadn't been a coincidence at all. It had been Von Sokolov's carefully calculated opening move. He leaned back in his chair and lit a cigar, the smoke curling upward and partially concealing his scheming face, while inside his mind, a dark plan slowly began to take shape, a plan he believed would finally allow him to overthrow the Falcone family's empire. What neither Emma nor Oliver yet understood was that invisible threads had already begun tightening around them, that danger was no longer something distant, but had crept into the lives of the people closest to Emma, and that the underworld she had only just discovered with such fear was no longer Oliver's burden alone. It had become the circle steadily closing around her own life. Von Sokolov's plan began unfolding in the quietest and most poisonous way possible, not through loud attacks, but by slipping into the cracks that already existed in Emma's life. His men approached Wanda and Coralie, not with threats, but with thick envelopes and sweet promises. They said they only needed a few small details about Emma, where she lived, how she worked, where she usually went, and whom she was close to. And in return, Beckett's debt would be extended, perhaps even reduced, while the family would receive additional money to cover their expenses. The most heartbreaking part, the part that made anyone shudder to think about, was that Wanda and Coralie didn't hesitate for long. To them, Emma had stopped being a daughter and a younger sister who needed protection long ago. She had become nothing more than a source of profit, a well they could draw from whenever they needed something. And now, when someone was willing to pay for information about her, they saw it as an opportunity rather than a betrayal. Coralie even clicked her tongue and said that Emma had changed her life anyway, that she now had a good job and powerful connections, so sharing a few details couldn't possibly hurt her, especially when it would help the whole family. They persuaded themselves with those selfish justifications, and little by little, every fragment of Emma's life was passed into Vaughn's hands, turning her own flesh and blood into pieces on the board of an enemy she had never even met. Armed with the information they gathered, Vaughn's people began tightening the circle around Emma, but they never laid a hand on her, because Vaughn understood that the most terrifying weapon wasn't violence, it was fear. One morning, when Emma opened the door of her room to leave for work, she discovered an envelope pushed beneath it. There was no written threat inside, only several photographs taken secretly of her as she left the restaurant late at night, waited at the bus stop, and bought groceries at the store near her home. Every image had been captured from a distance so close it was chilling, close enough to prove that someone had been quietly following her every step while she remained completely unaware. There wasn't a single written line or message, and it was that silence that made the fear seep into her bones, because it told her that whoever stood behind all of this didn't need to say anything. They only wanted her to know that she was completely within their sight. The days that followed became a long nightmare for Emma. She began startling at every sound, glancing over her shoulder whenever she walked down the street, and the feeling of invisible eyes watching her made peaceful sleep impossible. Her phone occasionally rang from unfamiliar numbers, and whenever she answered, there was only silence on the other end, or the steady sound of someone breathing, or the familiar voice with the heavy foreign accent making vague remarks about Beckett, about the debt, about how her family would be perfectly safe if she behaved sensibly. They never told her directly what they wanted, and that uncertainty only drove her deeper into panic, because she didn't know what she was supposed to do to escape, or what shape the trap closing around her had taken. What shattered Emma's heart even more than the fear was the dawning realization that the people following her seemed to know far too much about her schedule, details only someone inside her family could have known. At first, the thought passed through her mind only briefly, then slowly grew into a painful suspicion, until she could no longer deny that her own mother and sister might somehow be involved. She remembered their unusually restless behavior during their most recent visit, the casual questions they had asked about her new position, and one cruel piece after another began falling into place. Emma curled herself into the corner of the room, wrapped her arms around her knees, and this time, she could no longer hold back her tears. She didn't cry because she feared the strangers outside. She cried because the pain had come from the people who shared her blood, the people who should have been her final refuge in this world, yet who were now willing to push her into the jaws of danger for money. She felt more alone than she ever had before, trapped between two worlds, with the perilous underworld tightening its circle around her on one side, and the family who had turned their backs on her on the other. She no longer knew whom she could trust, or what she could hold on to, as the storm around her grew more violent with every passing hour. The fear that had been building inside Emma for days finally pushed her to the brink, and one evening, when Oliver stopped by the restaurant as he usually did, she could no longer remain silent. She waited until the last employee had gone home, then placed the photographs she had received on the table in front of him, her hands trembling with a tangled mixture of fear and anger. She asked whether he knew what they were, and before he had the chance to answer, she poured out everything she had been holding inside for so long. She told him that from the moment she had stepped into his world, her life hadn't known a single moment of peace, that she had been followed, threatened, and surrounded by people whose faces she didn't even know, and all because she had become involved with him. Her voice broke as she said that she had never asked for anything, had never dreamed of changing her life or entering this glittering world stained with blood, that all she had ever wanted was a quiet existence, the chance to earn an honest living and sleep peacefully each night, without waking in terror at every sound outside her door. Oliver stood in silence as she spoke, his face growing darker, and when he tried to explain that he would protect her, that he wouldn't allow anyone to hurt her, those very words only seemed to pour more fuel onto the fire. Emma let out a bitter laugh and told him that she didn't need protection, because she never would have needed protection if he hadn't drawn her into this turmoil in the first place. She said that he was accustomed to living in a world where every problem was solved through power and fear, but she wasn't. She came from somewhere else, and she wouldn't, become part of that darkness. For the first time in his life, Oliver Falcone, the man an entire city feared, stood before someone for whom all his wealth and power meant nothing, because what she needed was something he couldn't give her, and what she feared was the very man he was. He tried to move closer, his voice softening until it sounded almost pleading in a way he had never spoken to anyone before, telling her that he had never meant for her to suffer any of this, that she meant more to him than he had ever dared admit. But Emma shook her head as tears streamed down her face, and she said that perhaps that was the real problem, that she too had allowed her heart to respond to him, and that was precisely why she had to leave. If she stayed, she would lose the person she was, would slowly grow numb to the world she despised, and she would rather endure the pain of walking away than lose herself by remaining. She told him that she needed a life she could control for herself, not a life in which she existed only as the weakness of a powerful man, a piece in games she had never chosen to play. Those weren't the words of a weak woman fleeing in panic. They were the clear and courageous decision of someone strong enough to place her dignity and the peace of her own soul above a love that was steadily growing, strong enough to surrender what so many others would have sacrificed everything to possess. She placed the restaurant key on the table, relinquishing the responsibility the Falcone family had trusted her to carry, and said that she was sorry, that she was grateful for everything they had done for her, but that she had to go. Then she turned and walked out through the doors of Rosalind's, leaving behind the world that had opened before her like a dream only to become a nightmare, while the powerful man remained standing alone in the empty restaurant. Oliver stayed there for a long time after her small figure had vanished from sight, and for the first time in many years, he felt something he had believed he had lost long ago. Fear, not fear of an enemy or of death, but fear of losing another human being. In that hollow room, surrounded by silence, Oliver Falcone was finally forced to admit the truth he had avoided for so long, that he loved Emma Frost, deeply and desperately, and that the very world he had built, the world of power he had once taken pride in, had now become the wall separating him from the only woman who had ever made his frozen heart begin to beat again. After leaving Rosalind's, Emma didn't return to her room immediately, because amid all the heartbreak and fear, one thing continued to torment her without relief, and that was Beckett. Even though her mother and sister might have turned their backs on her, even though her younger brother had disappointed her countless times, she still couldn't cast aside her concern for the boy she had carried in her arms since he was an infant. She remembered the calls mentioning the debt, the way Beckett's name had been repeated again and again like a warning, and she decided that she had to uncover the truth, that she had to know where her brother truly was and what he had become entangled in. Using the few fragments of information she had managed to gather from conversations with several people who had once known Beckett, she traced him to a decaying building on the outskirts of the city, a place so isolated and silent that it sent a chill through her. After asking question after question while struggling against her fear, she finally found the place where her brother was being held, and the sight before her made her heart constrict. Beckett sat inside a miserable room, his face far more gaunt than it had been the last time she saw him, his eyes sunken from sleeplessness and terror. He wasn't lying in a hospital as her mother and sister had claimed. He was being confined, watched, and denied the freedom to come and go. When he saw his sister standing in the doorway, Beckett's first reaction wasn't relief, but absolute panic. He sprang to his feet and, in a trembling voice, demanded to know why she had come, telling her that she had to leave immediately, that this was exactly what they wanted. Emma stood bewildered, and then, in that cramped room, through tears of remorse, Beckett told her the entire truth. He confessed that he had been wrong, that he had acted recklessly and fallen into gambling, that he had been drawn deeper and deeper into underground casinos until his debt had grown beyond anything he could ever repay. But the more important truth he hurried to reveal was that he had recognized his mistake long ago and had tried to stop. He had searched for every possible way to escape that mire, struggled to repay the debt little by little, and tried to distance himself from the people who had lured him into it. It was because he had attempted to walk away that they had confined him, not because they wanted the money, for he had come to understand that they had never truly cared about the debt at all. Choking on his words, Beckett said that only later had he realized their real purpose, that he had merely been bait placed in advance, that his debt was nothing more than an excuse, and that the person they had truly targeted from the beginning was Emma. He explained that he had accidentally overheard the men guarding him speaking among themselves, that someone powerful stood behind everything, someone who intended to use Beckett and the entire family to control his sister, to turn her into a piece on a board designed to bring down a man whose name Beckett had heard only in passing. At that point, Beckett broke down and cried like a child. He seized his sister's hand and begged her to forgive him for every mistake he had made, apologized for dragging her into danger, and pleaded with her to run as far away as she could, to save herself before it was too late. He told her that he wasn't worth the risk, that he was willing to endure every consequence of what he had done as long as she remained safe. In that moment, Emma looked at her trembling younger brother, and her heart filled with both agony and immeasurable compassion. Beckett wasn't calculating and cruel like their mother and sister. He was simply a foolish young man who had made a terrible mistake and was now paying a devastating price for it. But amid all the ruin, he still possessed a conscience, still knew remorse, and above all, still loved his sister enough to place her safety above his own life. That discovery made Emma understand something painful, yet strangely comforting, that people didn't become alike merely because they shared the same blood, and that even within a family that had wounded her so deeply, one heart had not yet grown completely cold. She wrapped her arms tightly around her brother as their tears mingled, and in that moment, she understood that she couldn't abandon Beckett, couldn't turn away and flee alone as he begged her to do. But she also understood that she couldn't face the dark power surrounding them by herself, that to save her brother and save herself, she would have to confront the very truth she had just tried to escape, and perhaps seek out the only person in the world powerful enough to stand against that darkness. Setting aside her pride and her own fear, Emma went to Oliver, not because she intended to return to him, but because she understood that he was the only person powerful enough to help her rescue Beckett from the darkness closing around him. When she told him everything she had discovered, where her brother was being held, what Beckett had revealed, and the powerful hidden figure standing behind it all, Oliver's face darkened, and something appeared in his eyes that she had never seen before, a deadly coldness mingled with remorse, because he understood at once that his presence in her life had turned her into a target. He didn't say much. He only promised quietly that he would bring Beckett home safely, and that this time he would do it her way, without violence. That very night, Oliver summoned Gideon Marsh, and an entire silent machine began to move. Instead of sending armed men to storm the place, as his first instinct urged him to do, Oliver chose another path, one Emma herself had planted in his mind through their earlier conversations, to let justice and the law do the work they were meant to do. He knew perfectly well that von Sokolov was behind everything, his long-standing rival, and he also knew that a man like Vaughn couldn't be defeated through a simple confrontation, because he was too cunning and always found a way to slip free of every trap. So Oliver decided to strike at Vaughn's fatal weakness, the empire of predatory lending and underground gambling houses he used to bind countless people like Beckett. Gideon and Oliver's team moved quietly, tracing every financial channel, gathering evidence of crushing interest rates, ledgers containing the names of debtors, and statements from victims whom Vaughn had threatened and driven into desperation. They worked through days and nights without rest, fitting every piece of evidence together with painstaking care and secrecy, until Oliver held a case powerful enough to bury von Sokolov, not in a war between two criminal powers, but before a court of law. Then Oliver did something men from his world rarely considered. He arranged for the entire file to reach a federal prosecutor who had wanted for years to dismantle Vaughn's criminal network, but had never possessed enough evidence to act. Once every piece had been placed exactly where it belonged, Oliver finally chose to face his enemy directly. The meeting took place inside an abandoned warehouse deep in the industrial district, where Vaughn had Oliver escorted after accepting his request to meet, no doubt believing that he had finally forced his rival into a position of weakness. But when Oliver entered with measured steps, and not the slightest trace of fear in his eyes, Vaughn began to sense that something was wrong. Oliver hadn't come to beg or bargain for Emma and Beckett's safety as Vaughn had expected. Instead, he placed a copy of the file on the weathered table in the center of the warehouse and, in a voice so calm it was chilling, told Vaughn that every piece of evidence inside it, enough to keep him in prison for the rest of his life, was already in the hands of federal investigators. He said that with a single signal from him, or if anything happened to him, to Emma, to Beckett, or to anyone he cared about, the case would immediately move forward, Vaughn's entire empire would collapse, and the charges against him would pile up beyond escape. The confident smile that had always rested on Vaughn's face now froze, because he understood that he had been cornered in a way he had never imagined, not with guns or fists, but by the very laws he had always despised. Oliver gave him two clear choices. He could release Beckett immediately, leave Emma and her family alone, and disappear from the city forever, or he could remain and face the federal agents, who were waiting only for the order to move. The air inside the warehouse thickened, tense as a rope about to snap, while two of the underworld's most powerful men stood facing one another, and this time, the advantage didn't belong to the man with more soldiers or more weapons. It belonged to the man who had learned to use intelligence and the law to transform his weakness into strength, turning Emma's faith in justice into the sharpest weapon he had ever held. Von Sokolov, cornered with nowhere left to turn, made the final fatal mistake of a man accustomed to winning. He believed he still had a way out. He gave a cold laugh, tried to appear composed, and challenged Oliver by claiming that he was bluffing, that there was no possibility a crime boss like him would ever cooperate with federal authorities, the very institution both of them despised. But while Vaughn was still speaking with that arrogant confidence, the roar of multiple engines suddenly erupted outside the warehouse, followed by beams of light flashing through the gaps in the old corrugated metal walls, and then the commanding voices of federal agents rang out, ordering everyone inside to surrender. Vaughn's face drained of color as he realized that Oliver's warning hadn't been an empty threat. In the chaos that followed, Oliver merely stepped back several paces with perfect calm, because he had anticipated everything and arranged for the raid to begin at precisely that moment, transforming a meeting that had appeared to be a trap for him into one that closed around the man who had set it. Vaughn's men scrambled desperately for an escape, but it was already too late. The entire warehouse had been surrounded, and within minutes, the same men who had strutted with arrogance only moments earlier were subdued. Von Sokolov, the man who had spread fear throughout the city's underworld for years, the man who had used debt and threats to enslave countless people, was finally led out of the warehouse in handcuffs, his face twisted with rage and helplessness, his bloodshot eyes fixed on Oliver, with the hatred of a man who had just realized he had lost completely in the game he believed he understood better than anyone. The entire empire of predatory loans and underground casinos he had spent years building now became the most powerful evidence against him, burying him beneath one criminal charge after another, while the prison doors he had once used to terrify others now stood open, waiting for him. While the raid unfolded, Gideon, Marsh, and several of Oliver's men followed the information Emma had provided and quickly reached the building where Beckett was being held. None of the guards dared stand in their way once news of Vaughn's downfall began to spread, and the door to that miserable room was forced open. After so many days of living in fear and despair, Beckett initially recoiled, believing his captors had returned, but when he understood that he had been freed and that the nightmare had finally ended, his knees nearly gave way beneath the force of his relief. He was led outside and breathed in the air of freedom he had believed he might never experience again. And the first thing he asked wasn't whether he himself was safe, but whether his sister was unharmed. When the car carrying Beckett returned and he stepped out, Emma was already waiting, and the moment brother and sister saw each other, every barrier, every wound, and every mistake from the past seemed to dissolve. Emma rushed forward and wrapped her arms around her younger brother, and this time, her tears didn't fall from pain or fear, but from overwhelming relief, the feeling of someone who had finally been freed from the crushing weight that had rested upon her shoulders for so many days. She held Beckett tightly, as though afraid he might disappear again if she let go, and he clung to her in return, repeating his apologies through broken sobs. Standing quietly at a respectful distance, Oliver watched their reunion, and something entirely different appeared in the eyes that had long been accustomed to coldness, a silent tenderness, because he understood that what he had given Emma wasn't money or power, but the most precious thing she had always longed for, peace and reunion with the brother she loved. He hadn't resolved the matter in his old way. He hadn't left blood and terror behind him. Instead, he had chosen the path she had shown him, the path of justice, and for the first time in his life, he felt a kind of satisfaction he had never known before. Not the satisfaction of a victor crushing an enemy, but the quiet warmth of a man who had protected what he treasured. The dark storm had passed, the danger that had stalked them for so long had finally been removed, and amid the reunion and tears of happiness, one turbulent chapter in Emma's life came to an end, making way for everything that still remained unfinished between her and the man who had quietly begun to change because of her. People often say that those who grow accustomed to draining others will never stop as long as there is still something left to take, and that truth proved itself only days after Beckett was freed. Completely unaware of what had truly happened, or perhaps fully aware and deliberately choosing to ignore it, Wanda and Coralie came to Emma again, this time with a performance even more shameless than before. They produced a forged debt agreement bearing Beckett's signature, weeping dramatically as they claimed that dangerous loan sharks were threatening to destroy the family, and they demanded that Emma use her new position to hand over a vast sum immediately to clear her brother's name. They acted out the entire scene with tears and familiar accusations, certain that, as always, Emma would soften and open her wallet. But this time, everything was different. Just as Wanda's voice rose to its most dramatic pitch, Oliver stepped forward from behind them, his posture composed and his gaze sharp and cold, and his appearance brought both women to an abrupt silence. In a deep and measured voice that carried an undeniable weight, he exposed their entire deception. He told them that Beckett wasn't dying at all, that he was healthy and safe, that Oliver himself had brought him out of captivity, and that he knew every detail of how they, Emma's own mother and sister, had sold information about her to the enemy for money and placed her in grave danger. Wanda and Coralie's faces drained of color as they listened, because they understood that this time they weren't facing the trusting, tender-hearted Emma they had always manipulated, but a man who possessed evidence of every dishonest thing they had done. Oliver told them plainly that from that moment forward, if they ever tried again to harass, threaten, or exploit Emma, everything they had done, including their cooperation with Vaughn's people, would be turned over to the authorities, and they would be held legally accountable. He didn't raise his voice or threaten them with violence. He simply placed before them the legal consequences they would face, and that alone destroyed the weapon of family obligation they had used for years to control her. With nothing left to bargain with, and no tears capable of sustaining the performance, Wanda and Coralie withdrew in the humiliation of people whose true faces had been exposed. And for the first time in her life, Emma felt genuinely free from the invisible chain that had tightened around her for so many years. When only she and Oliver remained, Emma turned toward him and spoke the words she had carried inside for so long, not with anger, but with honesty. She thanked him for everything he had done for her and Beckett, but she also told him directly that gratitude couldn't erase the fear within her. She said that she had spent her entire life living in uncertainty, and what she desired most wasn't to be protected by someone else, but to live a life she could govern for herself, a life built upon respect rather than fear, a life untouched by blood and violence. She looked directly into his eyes and told him that she couldn't love and couldn't remain beside a man while constantly fearing that she might lose him the next day, that if there was ever to be a future between them, it had to be a future in which she wasn't forced to live in a world of darkness. Oliver listened to every word, and instead of arguing or offering empty promises, he remained silent for a long time. Then he told her something he had never imagined himself saying, that he had decided to withdraw from every dark part of his empire, that he would devote the rest of his life to rebuilding everything along an honest path, preserving only the restaurant chain and the legitimate businesses his parents had once dreamed of creating. He told her that she hadn't demanded that he change, but that she had shown him another way of living, one worth choosing, that her goodness and compassion had accomplished what no enemy or threat had ever managed to do. They had made him want to save himself. At that moment, Rosalind approached and took Emma's hand, then quietly told her the deeper reason she and Arthur had once disguised themselves as beggars. She explained that after a lifetime of witnessing the darkest sides of wealth and power, they had gradually lost their faith in human goodness. They had begun to wonder whether anyone in the world still treated another person with kindness without expecting something in return, and in their despair, they had gone searching for an answer. Rosalind looked at Emma with tears shining in her eyes and told her that she, the poor young woman who had knelt to wipe the stains from an elderly stranger, had restored that faith, had rekindled within them the flame of hope they had believed had gone out forever. A few months later, when Chicago's brutal winter had finally given way to warmer days, Rosalind's had taken on an entirely new appearance, not in its decorations or its menu, but in the very spirit that seemed to radiate from within it. Under Emma's management, Rosalind's was no longer a cold place reserved only for those with money, but had become somewhere every person who walked through the door was welcomed with equal respect. And what people spoke of most wasn't the exquisite food, but a special table that was always kept open each evening. A free table for people in hardship, for the homeless, for those who had lost their way, so they could have a decent meal and a warm place to sit without anyone looking at them with contempt. On that table, Emma always made sure there was a bottle of water and several cookies waiting, just as she had carried them with her throughout her life. The habit of someone who had once known the taste of hunger and understood that even the smallest act could bring warmth to an entire soul. Beckett, after all his mistakes and failures, truly began again. He asked for work at the restaurant, starting with the humblest tasks and approaching each one with gratitude and humility, slowly making amends for what he had done, and repairing his bond with the sister who hadn't abandoned him when he was at his lowest. Oliver kept his promise as well, gradually withdrawing from the darkest parts of his former empire, so he could devote himself to rebuilding everything along an honest path, just as his parents had once dreamed. Then, one evening, after the last guests had gone home and the restaurant was left beneath the gentle glow of its lights, Oliver finally did what he had carried in his heart for a long time. In the middle of Rosalind's, in the very place where he had first seen Emma kneeling to wipe the stains from his mother's hair, where the lives of two people from entirely different worlds had crossed by chance, he lowered himself onto one knee before her. There was no display of power, no extravagant performance, only a man who had once been cold and feared standing before the woman who had changed his entire life, offering her nothing but complete sincerity. He told her that she had taught him that true strength didn't lie in the fear a person could spread, but in the kindness they were willing to give, that she had made him want to become a better man, and that he was asking her to allow him to spend the rest of his life beside her, not as a powerful man protecting someone weaker, but as two equals building an honest life together. With tears shining in her eyes, Emma looked at the man kneeling before her, the man who had chosen to leave an entire world of darkness behind so he could become worthy of her love, and she understood that she was saying yes not because he was wealthy or powerful, but because he had possessed the courage to choose the best version of himself. She gave a small nod, and in that moment, beneath the warm and loving gazes of Arthur, Rosalind, Beckett, and the elderly head chef Walter Boyd, a new chapter of their lives officially began, a chapter written not in blood and tears, but in kindness and hope. Some people are born like wild grass beside the road, stepped on, forgotten, raised in deprivation, and rarely touched by sunlight, yet fate can still be gentle in its own mysterious way, because as long as a human heart continues to hold kindness and hope, light will eventually find its way there like a promise that never arrives too late. And sometimes, the smallest act of compassion has enough power to make an entire garden bloom again when everyone believed it had already withered. Emma's story reminds us that a person's dignity is never measured by the amount of money in their pocket or the clothes they wear, that the way we treat people who can offer us nothing in return reveals who we truly are, and that kindness given without calculation, no matter how small, can create miracles we could never have imagined, changing not only the life of the person who receives it, but sometimes saving the soul of the person who gives it. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share this video so you can hear many more meaningful and captivating stories every day. How do you feel about Emma's story? And what does it remind you of in your own life? Have you ever witnessed or offered a small act of kindness that remained engraved in your heart long afterward? We would truly love to hear the deepest feelings from your heart. So don't hesitate to leave a comment sharing your story and your thoughts, because perhaps your words may become a source of encouragement and light for someone who desperately needs them. Thank you sincerely for taking the time to listen until the very last moment, and we wish everyone watching this video lasting good health, a joyful life each day, and a heart that is always at peace. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next videos.